Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Oh wow, everybody's here already. My bad. Um, that wasn't too bad. I couldn't find where I put my ibuprofen, so I lost my mind for the last 5 minutes. Anyway, I found it. So, welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to keep reading from the Hyperion Cantos, specifically the second volume, The Fall of Hyperion. So previously on, so Father Paul de Rey is back, risen in less than 3 days. So it's not super biblical, but pretty biblical, from the dead husk of Lenar Hoyt. So he's back, he's up and running around, well, moving around anyway. Let's see, Martin Silenus is now impaled on the Tree of Thorns, which isn't a good time for him, or really any of the multitudes that are. Let's see. Colonel Kassad has gone off to fight the Shrike. He's gone through a portal to do that. It's leading to a different time or space or both. So he's going to get in on that. And let's see. Brawne Lamia. Oh, yeah. Brawne Lamia got attacked by the Shrike. I forgot to mention that. The Shrike has jabbed his finger in her head parts. For reasons that only the Shrike knows. The Shrike is a special boy. Special. Six-limbed hell creature. Anyway. So this is some art that I've had for like a decade or more now, by um, Alex Riez. It is, I believe, supposed to be the Colonel fighting the Shrike. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's phenomenal. Um, I love this depiction of the Shrike. It is my personal favorite. It is human shaped in only the most general possible sense. All of its proportions are just ever so slightly, ever so subtly, horribly wrong. So its limbs look kind of like an insect or praying mantis. It's covered in all sorts of pokey bits and sharp parts, but it looks kind of like a contiguous critter. It's got the big poker on the chest. Everything's there. The glowing eyes, the menacing grimace, and the seriously bad attitude. It's all there. Anyway, so that's a good one. I've been wanting to do this pretty much the entire share this one pretty much the entire time I've been reading these. So, oh yeah, and in case anyone is wondering why we haven't been doing the first-person perspective reading from the perspective of our good friend, the current Keats Cybrid, who's going under the alias of the painter guy, whose name is eluding me because my brain is having a hard time right now. Oh, what's his name? Anyway, because he dreams the events that are going on Hyperion because of his connection, presumably, to the Shrone-looped version of himself stuck in Brawne Lamia's head. He right now, I believe, has taken a bunch of drugs, sleeping pills, because the plan was not uh, not to dream. This didn't work, obviously, because we in part 2 of the book right now, which I don't know, I was just at it. Um, how many pages into it are we? Like 60 pages in. And he has not had a perspective moment yet. So, um, yeah, but what's the name of the guy whose name he's using? The artist. Please, Frag, don't forget these things, Frag. They're sort of important, Frag. Interestingly, this has included perspective pieces on Maina Gladstone. What's his name? Joseph Severn. There we go. Took us long enough, but we got there. That's the name, the alias he's using. Joseph Severn was one of OG Keats, his friends, someone who was there towards the end of his life while he was in Venice? Italy, anyway. Or was it Vienna? It was Venice, right? Anyway, Fragg's terrible grasp of poetic history, or where certain poets were at certain points in time in their life, even though they've been mentioned repeatedly in the book. That aside, things are about to get pretty heavy now that Het Masteen, the true voice of the tree, he's back. So I get to do the weird voice again. It is my terrible imitation of a guy I used to work with. Actually, believe it or not, based on a real person. Anyway, things are about to get real interesting. Not as interesting as a while from now when things are going to get really interesting, but, you know, pretty interesting, I would say. Pretty interesting. The whole book's interesting. Well, series, really. Oh, yeah. That might be next. No, that's going to be the week after next, probably. Things are going to get intense. More intense than a circus. It's going to be nuts. I am so hyped. All right, so let's get cracking on, I think it's chapter 25 we're on now. Making headway. Making headway. Making some real progress. It's pretty cool. So yeah. Hope y'all ready. Strap in. Get ready to enjoy more of The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Thanks for tuning in, Casper Cringe via Twitch. If you ever want to listen to these after the fact, they're all on my YouTube channel, which should be in the stream description. Chapter 25. Saul, the consul, Father de Ray, and the unconscious Het Masteen were in the first of the cave tombs when they heard the shots. The consul went out alone, slowly, carefully, testing for the storm of time tides which had driven them deeper into the valley. "It's all right," he called back. The pale glow of Saul's lantern lighted the back of the cave, illuminating 3 pale faces and the robed bundle that was the Templar. "The tides have lessened," called the consul. Saul stood. His daughter's face was a pale oval below his own. "Are you sure the shots came from Brawne's gun?" The consul motioned toward the darkness outside. "None of the rest of us were carried a slug thrower. I'll go check." "Wait," said Saul. "I'll go with you." Father Duray remained kneeling next to Het Masteen. "Go ahead. I'll stay with him." "One of us will check back within the next few minutes," said the consul. The valley glowed from the pale light of the time tombs. Wind roared from the south, but the airstream was higher tonight, above the cliff walls, and the dunes on the valley floor were not disturbed. Saul followed the consul as he picked his way down the rough trail to the valley floor and turned toward the head of the valley. Slight tugs of déjà vu reminded Saul of the violence of the time tides an hour earlier, but now even the remnants of the bizarre storm were fading. Where the trail widened on the valley floor, Saul and the consul walked together past the scorched battlefield of the crystal monolith, the tall structure exuding a milky glow, reflected by the countless shards littering the floor of the arroyo, then climbing slightly past the jade tomb with its pale green phosphorescence, then turning again and following the gentle switchbacks leading up to the Sphinx. "My God!" whispered Saul, and rushed forward, trying not to jar his sleeping child in her carrier. He knelt by the dark figure on the top step. "Brawne?" asked the consul, stopping 2 paces back and panting for breath after the sudden climb. "Yes." Saul started to lift her head and then jerked his hand back when he encountered something slick and cool extruding from her skull. "Is she dead?" Saul held his daughter's head closer to his chest as he checked for a pulse in the woman's throat. "No," he said, and took a deep breath. "She's alive, but unconscious. Give me your light." Saul took the flashlight and played it over Brawne Lamia's sprawled form, following the silver cord. Tentacle was a better description, since the thing had a fleshy mass to it that made one think of organic origins, which led from the neural shunt socket in her skull across the broad top step of the Sphinx, in through the open portal. The Sphinx itself glowed the brightest of any of the tombs, but the entrance was very dark. The consul came closer. "What is it?" He reached out to touch the silver cable, jerked his hand back as quickly as Saul had. "My God, it's warm." "It feels alive," agreed Saul. He had been chafing Brawne's hands, and now he slapped her cheeks lightly, trying to awaken her. She did not stir. He swiveled and played the flashlight beam along the cable where it snaked out of sight down the entrance corridor. "I don't think this is something she voluntarily attached herself to." "The Shrike," said the consul. He leaned closer to activate biomonitor readouts on Brawne's wrist comlog. "Everything is normal except her brainwaves, Saul." "What do they say?" "They say that she's dead. Brain dead, brain dead at least. No higher functions whatsoever." Saul sighed and rocked back on his heels. "We have to see where that cable goes." "Can't we just unhook it from the shunt socket?" "Look," said Saul, and played the light on the back of Brawne's head while lifting a mass of dark curls away. The neural shunt, normally a plasflesh disc a few millimeters wide with a 10 micrometer socket, had seemed to melt, flesh rising in a red welt to connect with the micro-lead extensions of the metal cable. "It would take surgery to remove that," whispered the consul. He touched the angry-looking welt of flesh. Brawne did not stir. The consul retrieved the flashlight and stood. "You stay with her. I'll follow it in." "Use the comm channels," said Saul, knowing how useless they had been during the rise and fall of the time tides. The consul nodded and moved forward quickly before fear made him hesitate. The chrome cable snaked down the main corridor, turning out of sight beyond the room where the pilgrims had slept the night before. The consul glanced in the room, the flashlight beam illuminating the blankets and packs they had left behind in their hurry. He followed the cable around the bend in the corridor. through the central portal where the hallway broke into three narrower halls, up a ramp and right again down the narrow passage they had called King Tut's Highway during their earlier explorations, then down a ramp, along a low tunnel where he had to crawl, placing his hands and knees carefully so as not to touch the flesh-warm metal tentacle, up an incline so steep that he had to climb it like a chimney, down a wider corridor he did not remember, where stones leaned inward toward the ceiling, moisture dripping, and then down steeply, slowing his descent only by losing skin on his palms and knees, crawling finally along a stretch longer than the Sphinx had appeared wide. The consul was thoroughly lost, trusting in the cable to lead him back out when the time came. "Saul," he called at last, not believing for an instant that the communicator would carry through stone and time tides. "Here," came the barest whisper of the scholar's voice. "I'm way the hell inside," the consul whispered into his comm log. "Down a corridor I don't remember us seeing before. It feels deep." "Did you find where the cable ends?" "Yeah," the consul replied softly, sitting back to wipe sweat from his face with a handkerchief. "Nexus?" asked Saul, referring to one of the countless terminal nodes where web citizens could jack into the datasphere. "No, the thing seems to flow directly into the stone of the floor here. The corridor ends here, too. I've tried moving it, but the join is similar to where the neural shunt's been welded to her skull. It just seems part of the rock." "Come on out," came Saul's voice over the rasp of static. "We'll try to cut it off her." In the damp and darkness of the tunnel, the consul felt true claustrophobia close on him for the first time in his life. He found it hard to breathe. He was sure that something was behind him in the darkness, closing off his air and only avenue of retreat. The pounding of his heart was almost audible in the tight stone crawlway. He took slow breaths, wiped his face again, and forced the panic back. "That might kill her," he said, between slow gasps for air. No answer. The consul called again, but something had cut off their thin connection. "I'm coming out," he said into the silent instrument, and turned around, playing his flashlight along the low tunnel. Had the cable tentacle twitched, or was that just a trick of the light? The consul began crawling back the way he had come. "1488 Cyrillic, something Cyrillic. I'm sorry, I need to bone up on my Cyrillic text. I don't know what that says. Sorry, Casper Cringe. I have no idea what that means." They had found Het Masteen at sunset, just minutes before the time storm struck. The Templar had been staggering when the consul, Saul, and Duray had first seen him, and by the time they reached his fallen form, Masteen was unconscious. "Carry him to the Sphinx," said Saul. At that moment, as if choreographed by the setting sun, the time tides flowed over them like a tidal wave of nausea and déjà vu. All three men fell to their knees. Rachel awoke and cried with the vigor of the newly born and terrified. "Make for the valley entrance!" gasped the consul, standing with Het Masteen draped over his shoulder. "Got to get out the valley!" The three men moved toward the mouth of the valley, past the first tomb, the Sphinx, but the time tides became worse, blowing against them like a terrible wind of vertigo. 30 meters beyond, and they could climb no more. They fell to hands and knees, Het Masteen rolling across the hard-packed trail. Rachel had ceased wailing and writhed in discomfort.
"Back!" gasped Paul de Rey. "Back down the valley! It was better below."
They retraced their steps, staggering along the trail like three drunkards, each carrying a burden too precious to be dropped. Below the Sphinx they rested a moment, backs to a boulder, while the very fabric of space and time seemed to shift and buckle around them. It was as if the world had been the surface of a flag and someone had unfurled it with an angry snap. Reality seemed to billow and fold, then plunge farther away, folding back like a wave cresting above them. The consul left the Templar lying against the rock and fell to all fours, panting, fingers clinging to the soil in panic.
"The Mobius cube,"
said the Templar, stirring, his eyes still closed.
"We must have the Mobius cube."
Damn, managed the consul. He shook Het Masteen roughly. Why do we need it? Masteen, why do we need it? The Templar's head bobbed back and forth limply. He was unconscious once again.
"I'll get it,"
said Dure. The priest looked ancient and ill, his face and lips pale. The consul nodded, lifted Het Masteen over his shoulder, helped Saul gain his feet, and staggered away down the valley, feeling the riptides of anti-entropic fields lessen as they moved farther away from the Sphinx. Father de Rey had climbed the trail, climbed the long stairway, and staggered to the entrance of the Sphinx, clinging to the rough stones. Oh, sorry. There's a line break that threw me there. Father de Rey had climbed the trail, climbed the long stairway, and staggered to the entrance of the Sphinx, clinging to the rough stones there the way a sailor would cling to a thrown line in rough seas. The Sphinx seemed to totter above him, first tilting 30 degrees one way, then 50 the other. De Rey knew that it was only the violence of the time tides distorting his senses, but it was enough to make him keel and vomit on the stone. The tides paused a moment, like a violent surf resting between terrible wave assaults, and de Rey found his feet, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stumbled into the dark tomb. He had not brought a flashlight. Stumbling, he felt his way along the corridor, appalled by the twin fantasies of touching something slick and cool in the darkness, or of stumbling into the room where he was reborn and finding his own corpse there, still mouldering from the grave. De Rey screamed, but the sound was lost in the tornado roar of his own pulse as the time tides returned in force. The sleeping room was dark, that terrible dark which means the total absence of light, but de Rey's eyes adjusted, and he realized that the Mobius cube itself was glowing slightly, telltales winking. He stumbled across the cluttered room and grabbed the cube, lifting the heavy thing with a sudden burst of adrenaline. The consul's summary tapes had mentioned this artifact, Masteen's mysterious luggage during the pilgrimage, as well as the fact that it was believed to hold an erg, one of the alien force field creatures used to power a Templar tree ship. De Rey had no idea why the erg was important now, but he clutched the box to his chest as he struggled back down the corridor, outside and down the steps, deeper into the valley. "Here!" called the consul from the first cave tomb at the base of the cliff wall. "It's better here!" De Rey staggered up the trail, almost dropping the cube in his confusion and sudden draining of energy. The consul helped him the last 30 steps into the tomb. It was better inside. De Rey could feel the ebb and flow of time tides just beyond the cave entrance, but back in the rear of the cave, glow globes revealing elaborate carvings in their cold light, it was almost normal. The priest collapsed next to Saul Weintraub and set the Mobius cube near the silent but staring form of Het Masteen.
He just awakened as you approached, whispered Saul. The baby's eyes were very wide and very dark in the weak light. The consul dropped down next to the Templar. Why do we need the cube? Masteen, why do we need it? Het Masteen's gaze did not falter. He did not blink. Our ally, he whispered. Our only ally against the Lord of Pain. The syllables were etched with the distinctive dialect of the Templar world. How is it our ally? Demanded Saul, grabbing the man's robe in both his fists. How do we use it? When? The Templar's gaze was set on something in the infinite distance. We vied for the honor, he whispered, voice hoarse. The true voice of the Sequoia Sempervirens was the first to contact the Keats retrieval hybrid. But I was one honored by the light of the Muir. It was the Yggdrasil, my Yggdrasil, which was offered in atonement for our sins against the Muir. The Templar closed his eyes. A slight smile looked incongruous on his stern-featured face. The consul looked at Duray and Saul. That sounds more like Shrike cult terminology than Templar dogma. Perhaps it is both, whispered Duray. There have been stranger coalitions in the history of theology. Saul lifted his palm to the Templar's forehead. The tall man was burning up with fever. Saul rummaged through their only med pack in search of a pain derm or fever patch. Finding one, he hesitated. I don't know if Templars are within standard med norms. I don't want some allergy to kill him. The consul took the fever patch and applied it to the Templar's frail upper arm. They're within the norm. He leaned closer. Masteen, what happened on the wind wagon? The Templar's eyes opened, but remained unfocused. Wind wagon? I don't understand, whispered Father Duray. Saul took him aside. Masteen never told his tale on the pilgrimage out, he whispered. He disappeared during our first night out on the wind wagon. Blood was left behind, plenty of blood, as well as his luggage and the Mobius cube, but no Masteen. What happened on the wind wagon? The consul whispered again. He shook the Templar slightly to get his attention. Think, true voice of the tree, Het Masteen. The tall man's face changed, his eyes coming into focus, the vaguely Asiatic features settling into familiar, stern lines. I released the elemental from his confinement. The Erg. The Erg, Saul whispered to the baffled priest, had bound him with the mind discipline I had learned in the high branches. But then, without warning, the Lord of Pain came unto us. The Shrike, Saul whispered, more to himself than to the priest. Was it your blood spilled there? The consul asked the Templar. Blood? Masteen drew his hood forward to hide his confusion. No, it was not my blood. The Lord of Pain had a celebrant in his grasp. The man fought, attempted to escape the atonement spikes. What about the Erg? Pressed the consul. The elemental. What did you expect it to do for you? To protect you from the Shrike? The Templar frowned and raised a trembling hand to his brow. It was not ready. I was not ready. I returned it to its confinement. The Lord of Pain touched me on the shoulder. I was pleased that my atonement should be within the same hour as the sacrifice of my tree ship. Saul leaned closer to Duray. The tree ship Yggdrasil was destroyed in orbit that same evening, he whispered. Het Masteen closed his eyes. Tired, he whispered, his voice fading. The consul shook him again. How did you get here? Masteen, how did you get here from the Sea of Grass? I awoke among the tombs, whispered the Templar without opening his eyes. Awoke among the tombs. Tired, must sleep. Let him rest, said Father Duray. The consul nodded and lowered the robed man into a sleeping position. Nothing makes sense, whispered Saul as the three men and an infant sat in the dim light and felt the time tides ebb and flow outside. We lose a pilgrim, we gain one, muttered the consul. It's as if some bizarre game were being played. An hour later, they had heard the shots echo down the valley. Saul and the consul crouched by the silent form of Brawne Lamia. We'd need a laser to cut that thing off, said Saul. With Kassad gone, so are our weapons. The consul touched the young woman's wrist. Cutting it off might kill her. According to the biomonitor, she's already dead. The consul shook his head. No, something else is going on. That thing may be tapping into the Keats cybrid persona she's been carrying. Perhaps when it's finished, it'll give us Brawne back. Saul lifted his 3-day-old daughter to his shoulder and looked out over the softly glowing valley. What a madhouse! Nothing's going as we thought. If only your damn ship were here. It would have cutting tools in case we have to free Brawne from this thing, and she and Masteen might have a chance for survival in the surgery. The consul remained kneeling, staring at nothing. After a moment he said, Wait here with her, please. Rose and disappeared in the dark maw of the Sphinx's entrance. 5 minutes later he was back with his own large travel bag. He removed a rolled rug from the bottom and unfurled it on the stone of the Sphinx's top stair. It was an ancient rug, a little less than 2 meters long and a bit more than a meter wide. The intricately woven cloth had faded over the centuries, but the monofilament flight threads still glowed like gold in the dim light. Thin leads ran from the carpet to a single power cell which the consul now detached. I just want to interrupt here and say that I think the fact that you trickle charge the hawking mats like you would a dead car battery is the best thing in the world. It's just the best. Just trickle charge. It'll be great. It'll be good. You'll be fine. The consul not. Oh, good God, whispered Saul. He remembered the consul's tale of his grandmother Ciri's tragic love affair with hegemony shipman Merrin Aspic. It had been a love affair that had raised a rebellion against the hegemony and plunged Maui Covenant into years of war. Merrin Aspic had flown to first sight on a friend's hawking mat. The consul nodded. It belonged to Mike Osho, Grandfather Merrin's friend. Ciri left it in her tomb for Merrin to find. He gave it to me when I was a child, just before the Battle of the Archipelago, where he and the dream of freedom died. Saul ran his hand across the centuries-old artifact. It's a shame it can't work here. The consul glanced up. Why can't it? The Hyperion's magnetic field is below the critical level for EM vehicles, said Saul. That's why there are dirigibles and skimmers rather than EMVs, why the Benares was no longer a levitation barge. He stopped, feeling foolish explaining this to a man who had been hegemony consul on Hyperion for 11 local years. Or am I wrong? The consul smiled. You're right that the standard EMVs aren't reliable here. Too much mass to lift ratio. But the hawking mat is all lift, almost no mass. I've tried it here when I lived in the capital. It's not a smooth ride, but it should work with one person aboard. Saul glanced back down the valley, past the glowing forms of the jade tomb, obelisk, and crystal monolith, to where the shadows of the cliff wall hid the entrance to the cave tombs. He wondered if Father Duray and Het Masteen were still alone, still alive. "You're thinking of going for help?" "One of us is going for help, bringing the ship back, or at least freeing it and sending it back unmanned. We could draw lots to see who goes." It was Saul's turn to smile. "Think, my friend. Duray is in no condition to travel, and does not know the way in any case. I Saul lifted Rachel until the top of her head touched his cheek. "The voyage might last several days. We do not have several days. If something is to be done for her, we must remain here and take our chances. It is you who must go." The consul sighed, but did not argue. "Besides," said Saul, "it is your ship. If anyone can free it from Gladstone's interdiction, you can. And you know the Governor General well." The consul looked toward the west. "I wonder if Theo is still in power." "Let's go back and tell Father Duray our plan," said Saul. "Also, I left the nursing packs in the cave, and Rachel is hungry." The consul rolled the carpet, slipped it in his pack, and stared down at Brawne Lamia, at the obscene cable snaking away into darkness. "Will she be all right?" "I'll have Paul come back with a blanket to stay with her while you and I carry our other invalid back here. Will you leave tonight or wait until sunrise?" The consul rubbed his cheeks tiredly. "I don't like the thought of crossing the mountain at night, but we can't spare the time. I'll leave as soon as I put some things together." Saul nodded and looked toward the entrance to the valley. "I wish Brawne could tell us where Silenus has gone." "I'll look for him as I fly out," said the consul. He glanced up at the stars. "Figure 36 to 40 hours of flying to get back to Keats. A few hours to free the ship. I should be back here within 2 standard days." Saul nodded, rocking the crying child. His tired but amiable expression did not conceal his doubt. He set his hand on the consul's shoulder. "It is right that we try, my friend. Come, let us talk to Father Duray, see if our other fellow traveler is awake, and eat a meal together. It looks as if Brawne brought enough supplies to allow us a final feast."
Chapter 26. When Brawne Lamia had been a child, her father a senator, and their home relocated, however briefly, from Lucis to the wooded wonders of Tau Ceti Center's administrative residential complex, she had seen the ancient flat film Walt Disney animation of Peter Pan. After seeing the animation, she had read the book, and both had captured her heart. For months the 5 standard-year-old girl had waited for Peter Pan to arrive one night and take her away. She had left notes pointing the way to her bedroom under the shingled dormer. She had left the house while her parents slept and lain on the soft grass of the Deer Park lawns, watching the milkish gray night sky of TC squared and dreaming of the boy from Neverland who would come some night soon to take her, who would some night. Okay. This happens. She had left the house while her parents slept and lain on the soft grass of the Deer Park lawns, watching the milkish gray night sky of TC squared and dreaming of the boy from Neverland who would, some night soon, take her away with him, flying toward the second star to the right, straight on till morning. She would be his companion, the mother to the lost boys, fellow nemesis to the evil Hook, and, most of all, Peter's new Wendy.
the new child friend to the child who would not grow old. And now, 20 years later, Peter had finally come for her. Peter had finally come for her. There we go. Emphasis on the right syllable. And now, 20 years later, Peter had finally come for her. Lamia had felt no pain, only the sudden, icy rush of displacement as the Shrike's steel talon penetrated the neural shunt behind her ear. Then she was away and flying. She had moved through the datum plane and into the datasphere before. Only weeks before her time, Lamia had ridden into the Technocore Matrix with her favorite cyberpuke, silly BB Serbringer, to help Johnny steal back his cybrid retrieval persona. They had penetrated the periphery and stolen the persona, but an alarm had been tripped. BB had died. Lamia never wanted to enter the datasphere again. But she was there now. The experience was like nothing she had ever had with comlog leads or nodes before. This was like full StimSim, like being in a holodrama with full color and wraparound stereo. This was like being there. Peter had finally come to take her away. Lamia rose above the curve of Hyperion's planetary limb, seeing the rudimentary channels of microwaved data flow and tight-beamed comlink that passed for an embryonic datasphere there. She did not pause to tap into it, for she was following an orange umbilical skyward toward the real avenues and highways of datum plane. Hyperion space had been invaded by Force and by the Ouster swarm, and both had brought the intricate folds and latticework of the datasphere with them. With new eyes, Lamia could see the 1,000 levels of Force data flow, a turbulent green ocean of information shot through with the red veins of secured channels, and the spinning violet spheres with their black phage outriders that were the Force AIs. This pseudopod of the great web megadatasphere flowed out of normal space through black funnels of shipboard farcasters, along expanding wavefronts of overlapping, instantaneous ripples that Lamia recognized as continuous bursts from a score of fatline transmitters. She paused, suddenly unsure of where to go, which avenue to take. It was as if she had been flying and her uncertainty had endangered the magic, threatening to drop her back to the ground so many miles below. As Douglas Adams so eloquently put it, flying is easy. The trick is to remember not to fall, or rather not to hit the ground. Then Peter took her hand and buoyed her up. "Johnny!" "Hello, Brawne." Her own body image clicked into existence at the same second she saw and felt his. It was Johnny as she had last seen him, her client and lover. Johnny of the sharp cheekbones, hazel eyes, compact nose, and solid jaw. Johnny's brownish-red curls still fell to his collar, and his face remained a study in purposeful energy. His smile still made her melt inside. "Johnny!" She hugged him then, and she felt the hug, felt his strong hands on her back as they floated high above everything, felt her breasts flatten against his chest as he returned the hug with surprising strength for his small frame. They kissed, and there was no denying that that was real. Lamia floated at arm's length, her hands on his shoulders. Both their faces were lighted by the green and violet glow of the great datasphere ocean above them. "Is this real?" She heard her own voice and dialect in the question, even though she knew she had only thought it. "Yes, real as any part of the datum plane matrix can be. We're on the edge of the megasphere in Hyperion space." His voice still held that elusive accent that she found so beguiling and maddening. "What happened?"
With the words, she conveyed images to him of the Shrike's appearance, the sudden, terrible invasion of the blade finger. Yes, thought Johnny, holding her more tightly. Somehow it freed me from the Shrone loop and jacked us directly into the datasphere. Am I dead, Johnny? The face of Johnny Keats smiled down at her. He shook her slightly, kissed her gently, and rotated so that they could both see the spectacle above and below. No, you're not dead, Brawne, although you may be hooked to some kind of bizarre life support while your datum plane analog wanders here with me. Are you dead? He grinned at her again. Not any longer, although life in a Shrone loop isn't all it's cracked up to be. It was like dreaming someone else's dreams. I dreamed about you. Johnny nodded. I don't think that was me. I dreamed the same dreams. Conversations with Maynard Gladstone, glimpses of the hegemony government councils. Yes. He squeezed her hand. I suspect that they reactivated another Keats cybrid. Somehow we were able to connect across all the light years. Another cybrid? How? You destroyed the core template, liberated the persona. Her lover shrugged. He was wearing a ruffled shirt and silk waistcoat of a style she had never seen before. The flow of data through the avenues above them painted both of them with pulses of neon light as they floated there. I suspected that there would be more backups than BB and I could find in such a shallow penetration of the core periphery. It doesn't matter, Brawne. If there's another copy, then he's me, and I can't believe that he'd be an enemy. Come on, let's explore. Lamia held back a second as he tugged her upward. Explore what? This is our chance to see what's going on, Brawne. A chance to get to the bottom of a lot of mysteries. She heard the uncharacteristic timidity in her own voice/thought. I'm not sure I want to, Johnny. He rotated to look at her. Is this the detective I knew? What happened to the woman who couldn't stand secrets? She's been through some rough times, Johnny. I've been able to look back and see that becoming a detective was, in large part, a reaction to my father's suicide. I'm still trying to solve the details of his death. In the meantime, a lot of people have gotten hurt in real life, including you, my dear. And have you solved it? What? Your father's death. Lamia frowned at him. I don't know. I don't think so. Johnny pointed toward the fluid mass of the datasphere ebbing and flowing above them. There are a lot of answers waiting up there, Brawne, if we have the courage to go looking for them. If we have the courage to go looking for them. She took his hand again. We could die there. Yes. Lamia paused, looked down toward Hyperion. The world was a dark curve with the few isolated data flow. The world was a dark curve with the few isolated data flow pockets glowing like campfires in the night. The great ocean above them seethed and pulsated with light and data flow noise, and Brawne knew that it was only the smallest extension of the megasphere beyond. She felt, that their reborn datum plane analogs could now go places no cyberpuke cowboy had ever dreamt of. With Johnny as her guide, Brawne knew that the megasphere and technocore were penetrable to depths no human had plumbed. And she was scared. But she was with Peter Pan at last, and Neverland beckoned. All right, Johnny, what are we waiting for? They rose together toward the megasphere. Chapter 27. Colonel Fedman Kassad followed Moneta through the portal and found himself standing upon a vast lunar plain where a terrible tree of thorns rose 5 kilometers high into a blood-red sky.
Human figures writhed on many of on the Human figures writhed on the many branches and spikes, the closer forms recognizably human and in pain, the farther ones dwarfed by distance until they resembled clusters of pale grapes. Kassad blinked and took a breath beneath the surface of his quicksilver skin suit. He looked around, past the silent form of Moneta, tearing his gaze from the obscenity of the tree. What he had thought was a lunar plain was the surface of Hyperion, at the entrance to the Valley of the Time Tombs, but a Hyperion terribly changed. The dunes were frozen and distorted as if they had been blasted and glazed into glass. The boulders and cliff faces also had flowed and frozen like glaciers of pale stone. There was no atmosphere. The sky was black with the pitiless clarity of airless moons everywhere. The sun was not Hyperion's. The light was not of human experience. Kassad looked up, and the viewing filters of his skin suit polarized to deal with the terrible energies that filled the sky with bands of blood red and blossoms of fierce white light. Below him, the valley seemed to vibrate as if to unfelt tremors. The time tombs glowed of their own interior energies, pulses of cold light thrown many meters across the valley floor from every entrance, portal, and aperture. The tombs looked new, slick, and shining. Kassad realized that only the skin suit was allowing him to breathe and saving his flesh from the lunar cold that had replaced the desert warmth. He turned to look at Moneta, attempted to phrase an intelligent question, failed, and raised his gaze to the impossible tree once again. The thorn tree seemed to be made of the same steel and chrome and cartilage as the shrike itself, obviously artificial and yet horribly organic at the same instant. The trunk was 200 or 300 meters thick at its base, the lower branches almost as broad, but the smaller branches and thorns soon tapered to stiletto thinness as they splayed toward the sky with their awful impalement of human fruit. Impossible that humans so impaled could live for long. Doubly impossible that they could survive in the vacuum of this place outside of time and space. But survive and suffer they did. Kassad watched them writhe. All of them were alive, and all were in pain. Kassad was aware of the pain as a great sound beyond hearing, a huge, incessant foghorn of pain, as if thousands of untrained fingers were falling on thousands of keys playing a massive pipe organ of pain. The pain was so palpable that he searched the blazing sky as if the tree were a pyre or huge beacon with the waves of pain clearly visible. There was only the harsh light and lunar stillness. Kassad raised the magnification of his skin suit viewing lenses and looked from branch to branch, thorn to thorn. The people writhing there were of both genders and all ages. They wore a variety of torn clothing and disarrayed cosmetics that spanned many decades, if not centuries. Many of the styles were not familiar to Kassad, and he assumed that he was looking at victims from his future. There were thousands, tens of thousands, of victims there. All were alive. All were in pain. Kassad stopped, focused on a branch 400 meters from the bottom, upon a cluster of thorns and bodies far out from the trunk, upon a single thorn 3 meters long, from which a familiar purple cape billowed. The form there writhed, twisted, and turned toward Fedman Kassad. He was looking at the impaled figure of Martin Silenus. Kassad cursed and formed fists so tight that the bones in his hands ached. He looked around for his weapons, magnifying vision to stare into the crystal monolith. There was nothing there. Colonel Kassad shook his head, realized that his skin suit was a better weapon than any he had brought to Hyperion, and began to stride toward the tree. He did not know how he would climb it, but he would find a way. He did not know how he would get Silenus down alive, get all of the victims down, but he would do so or die in the trying. Kassad took 10 paces and stopped on a curve of frozen dune. The Shrike stood between him and the tree. He realized that he was grinning fiercely beneath the chromium force field of the skin suit. This was what he had waited many years for. This was the honorable warfare he had pledged his life and honor for 20 years earlier in the Force Masada ceremony. Single combat between warriors. A struggle to protect the innocent. Kassad grinned, flattened the edge of his right hand into a silver blade, and stepped forward. Kassad! He looked back at Moneta's call. Light cascaded on the quicksilver surface of her nude body as she pointed toward the valley. A second Shrike was emerging from the tomb called the Sphinx. Farther down the valley, a Shrike stepped from the entrance to the Jade Tomb. Harsh light glinted from spikes and razor wire as another emerged from the obelisk, half a click away. Kassad ignored them and turned back toward the tree and its protector. 100 Shrikes stood between Kassad and the tree. He blinked, and 100 more appeared to his left. He looked behind him, and a legion of Shrikes stood as impassively as sculptures on the cold dunes and melted boulders of the desert. Kassad pounded his own knee with his fist. Damn! Moneta came up next to him until their arms touched. The skin suits flowed together, and he felt the warm flesh of her forearm against his. She stood thigh to thigh with him. I love you, Kassad. He gazed at the perfect lines of her face, ignored the riot of reflections and colors there, and tried to remember the first time he had met her, in the forest near Agincourt. He remembered her startling green eyes and short brown hair, the fullness of her lower lip, and how it tasted of tears the time he had accidentally bitten it. He raised a hand and touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of skin beneath the skin suit. If you love me, he sent, stay here. Colonel Fedman Kassad turned away then and let out a scream only he could hear in the lunar silence. A scream part rebel yell from the distant human past, part force cadet graduation shout, part karate cry, and part pure defiance. He ran across the dunes toward the thorn tree and the Shrike directly in front of it. There were thousands of Shrikes in the hills and valleys now. Talons clicked open in unison. Light glinted on tens of thousands of scalpel-sharp blades and thorns. Kassad ignored the others and ran toward the Shrike he thought was the first he had seen. Above the thing, human forms writhed in the solitude of their pain. The Shrike he was running toward opened its arms as if offering an embrace. Curved blades on its wrists, joints, and chest seemed to extend from hidden sheaths. Kassad screamed and closed the remaining distance. Hieronymus Bosch, eat your heart out. Chapter 28. Yes, Kassad is a badass. He is a massive badass. Born and bred. Um, Interestingly, of, I believe, Palestinian extraction, ultimately. Hmm. Maketh one think. Chapter 28. I'm pretty sure he was from the people he's descended from were Palestinians, and they moved to Mars, which is nominally terraformed, but it's sort of like not totally terraformed. There's survivable locations. Anyway, chapter 28. I shouldn't go, said the consul. He and Saul had carried the still unconscious Het Masteen from the cave tomb to the Sphinx, while Father Duray watched over Brawne Lamia. It was almost midnight, and the valley glowed from the reflected light of the tombs. The wings of the Sphinx cut arcs from the bit of sky visible to them between the cliff walls. I want to do that sentence again, so I do it without interrupting myself every other syllable.
My epiglottis said, "What are you doing? Don't do it like this, please."
I'm just going to take it from the top. Chapter 28. I shouldn't go, said the consul. He and Saul had carried the still unconscious Het Masteen from the cave tomb to the Sphinx, while Father Duray watched over Brawne Lamia. It was almost midnight, and the valley glowed from the reflected light of the tombs. The wings of the Sphinx cut arcs from the bit of sky visible to them between the cliff walls. Brawne lay motionless, the obscene cable snaking into the darkness of the tomb. Saul touched the consul's shoulder. We've discussed it. You should go. The consul shook his head and idly stroked the ancient hawking mat. It may be able to carry two. You and Duray could make it to where the Benares is tied up. Saul held his daughter's small head in the cusp of his hand as he gently rocked her. Rachel is 2 days old. Besides, this is where we must be. The consul looked around. His eyes showed his pain. This is where I should be. The Shrike. Duray leaned forward. The luminescence from the tomb behind them painted his high forehead and sharp cheeks with light. My son, if you stay here, it is for no other reason than suicide. If you attempt to bring the ship back for Lamia and the Templar, you will be helping others. The consul rubbed his cheek. He was very tired. There's room for you on the mat, father. Duray smiled. Whatever my fate may be, I feel that I am meant to meet it here. I will wait for your return. The consul shook his head again, but moved to sit cross-legged on the mat, pulling the heavy duffel bag toward him. He counted the ration packs and water bottles Saul had packed for him. There are too many. You'll need more for yourself. Duray chuckled. We have enough food and water for 4 days, thanks to Lamia. After that, if we have to fast, it will not be the first time for me. But what if Silenus and Kassad return? They can share our water, said Saul. We can make another trip to the keep for food if the others return. The consul sighed. All right. He touched the appropriate flight thread designs, and the 2 meters of carpet stiffened and rose 10 centimeters above the stone. If there was a wobble in the uncertain magnetic fields, it was not discernible. You'll need oxygen for the mountain crossing, said Saul. The consul lifted the osmosis mask from the pack. Saul handed him Lamia's automatic pistol. I can't. It won't help us with the Shrike, said Saul, and it might make the difference of whether you get the Keats or not. The consul nodded and set the weapon in his bag. He shook hands with the priest, then with the old scholar. Rachel's tiny fingers brushed his forearm. Good luck, said Duray. May God be with you. The consul nodded, tapped the flight designs, and leaned forward as the hawking mat lifted 5 meters, wobbled ever so slightly, and then slid forward and up as if riding invisible rails in the air. The consul banked right toward the entrance to the valley, passed 10 meters above the dunes there, and then banked left toward the barrens. He looked back only once. The 4 figures on the top step of the Sphinx, 2 men standing, 2 shapes reclining, looked very small indeed. He could not make out the baby in Saul's arms. As they had agreed, the consul aimed the hawking mat toward the west to overfly the city of poets in hopes of finding Martin Silenus. Intuition told him that the irascible poet might have detoured there. The skies were relatively free of the light of battle, and the consul had to search shadows unbroken by starlight as he passed 20 meters above the broken spires and domes of the city. There was no sign of the poet. If Brawne and Silenus had come this way, even their footprints in the sand had been erased by the night winds, which now moved the consul's thinning hair and flapped his clothing. It was cold on the mat at this altitude. The consul could feel the shudders and vibrations as the hawking mat felt its way along unsteady lines of force. Between Hyperion's treacherous magnetic field and the age of the EM flight threads, he knew that there was a real chance that the mat would tumble out of the sky long before he reached the capital of Keats. The consul shouted Martin Silenus's name several times, but there was no response except for an explosion of doves from their nesting place in the shattered dome of one of the gallerias. He shook his head and banked south toward the bridle range. I'm pretty sure that mass of doves bursting forth has happened literally every time anyone has ever gone here, so I'm tempted to call it the John Woo Galleria. If you know, you know. Through his grandfather Marin, the consul knew the history of this hawking mat. It had been one of the first such playthings handcrafted by Vladimir Sokolov, web-famous lepidopterist and EM systems engineer, and it may well have been the one he had given to his teenaged niece. Sokolov's love for the young girl had become legend, as had the fact that she spurned the gift of the flying carpet. But others had loved the idea, and while hawking mats were soon outlawed on worlds with sensible traffic control, they continued to show up on colonial planets. This one had allowed the consul's grandfather to meet his grandmother Siri on Maui Covenant. The consul looked up as the mountain range approached. 10 minutes of flying had covered the 2-hour hike across the barrens. The others had urged him not to stop at Kronos Keep to look for Silenus. Whatever fate might have befallen the poet there might well claim the consul too, before his journey had really begun. He contented himself with hovering just beyond the windows 200 meters up the cliff wall, an arm's length from the terrace where they had looked out at the valley 3 days before, and shouting for the poet. Only echoes answered him from the dark banquet halls and corridors of the keep. The consul held on tightly to the edges of the hawking mat, feeling the sense of height and exposure this close to the vertical stone walls. He was relieved when he banked the mat away from the keep, gained altitude, and climbed toward the mountain passes where snow gleamed in the starlight. He followed the cables of the tramway as they climbed the pass and connected one 9,000-meter peak to the next, across the wide span of the mountain range. It was very cold at this altitude, and the consul was glad for Kassad's extra thermal cape as he huddled under it, taking care not to expose the flesh of his hands or cheeks. The gel of the osmosis mask stretched across his face like some hungry symbiote, gobbling oxygen where little was to be found. It was enough. The consul took slow, deep breaths as he flew 10 meters above the ice-caked cables. None of the pressurized tramcars were running, and the isolation above the glaciers, sheer peaks, and shadow-shrouded valleys was heart-stopping. The consul was glad that he was attempting this trip, if for no other reason than to see Hyperion's beauty one last time, unspoiled by the terrible threat of the Shrike or Ouster invasion. It had taken the tramcar 12 hours to ferry them from south to north. Despite the hawking mat's slow 20-click-per-hour airspeed, the consul made the crossing in 6 hours. Sunrise caught him still above the high peaks. He startled awake, realized with a shock that he had been dreaming while the hawking mat flew on toward a peak rising another 5 meters above his altitude. The consul could see boulders and snowfields 50 meters ahead. A black bird with a 3-meter wingspan, one of those the locals called a harbinger, pushed off from its icy eyrie and floated in the thin air, looking back at the consul with black and beady eyes, while he banked steeply to the left, felt something give way in the hawking mat's flight gear, and fell 30 meters before the flight threads found purchase and leveled the carpet off. The consul gripped the edges of the mat with fingers gone white. He had tried the strap of his duffel bag he had tied. I don't know why I added an R there. He had tied the strap of his duffel bag around his belt. Otherwise, the bag would have tumbled off to a glacier far below. Glacier. There was no sign of the tramway. Somehow the consul had slept long enough to allow the hawking mat to drift off course. For a second he panicked, jinking the mat this way and that, desperate for a path between the peaks surrounding him like teeth. Then he saw the morning sunlight golden on the slopes ahead of him and to his right, the shadows leaping across glaciers and high tundra behind him and to his left, and he knew that he was still on the right track. Beyond this final spine of high peaks lay the southern foothills, and beyond that... The hawking mat seemed to hesitate as the consul tapped flight designs and urged it higher, but it rose in reluctant steps until it cleared the final 9,000-meter peak, and he could see the lower mountains beyond, dwindling to foothills a mere 3,000 meters above sea level. The consul descended with gratitude. He found the tram line gleaming in the sunlight, 8 clicks south of where he left the bridle range. Tramcars hung silently around the West Terminal Station. Below, the sparse buildings of the village of Pilgrim's Rest appeared as abandoned as they had several days earlier. There was no sign of the wind wagon where it had been left at the low pier leading out over the shallows of the Sea of Grass. The consul let down near the pier, deactivated the hawking mat, stretched his legs with some pain before rolling the mat up for safekeeping, and found a toilet in one of the abandoned buildings near the wharf. As he emerged, the morning sun was creeping down the foothills and erasing the last shadows there. As far as he could see to the south and west stretched the Sea of Grass, its tabletop smoothness belied by occasional breezes which sent ripples across the verdant surface, briefly revealing the russet and ultramarine stalks beneath in a movement so wave-like that one expected to see whitecaps and fish leaping. There were no fish in the Sea of Grass, but there were grass serpents 20 meters long, and if the consul's hawking mat failed him out there, even a safe landing would not keep him alive for long. The consul unrolled the mat, set his bag behind him, and activated the carpet. He stayed relatively low, 25 meters above the surface, but not so low that a grass serpent might mistake him for a low-flying morsel. It had taken the wind wagon less than a full Hyperion day to ferry them across the sea, but with the winds frequently from the northeast, that had involved quite a bit of tacking to and fro. The consul bet that he could fly across this narrowest part of the sea in less than 15 hours. He tapped the forward control designs, and the hawking mat sped faster. Within 20 minutes, the mountains had fallen behind until the foothills were lost in the haze of distance. Within an hour, the peaks began to shrink as the curve of the world hid their base. 2 hours out, and the consul could see only the highest of the peaks as an indistinct, serrated shadow rising from the haze. Then the Sea of Grass spread to all horizons, unchanging except for the sensuous ripples and furrows caused by the occasional breeze. It was much warmer here than on the high plateau north of the bridle range. The consul shed his thermal cape, then his coat, then his sweater. The sun beat down with surprising intensity for such high latitudes. The consul fumbled in his bag, found the wrinkled and battered tricorn cap he had worn with such aplomb just 2 days earlier, and wedged it on his head to give some shade. His forehead and balding skull were already sunburned. About 4 hours out, he ate his first meal of the trip, chewing on the tasteless strips of ration pack protein as if they were filet mignon. The water was the most delicious part of the meal, and the consul had to fight his urge to empty all the bottles in a single orgy of drinking. The sea of grass stretched below, behind, and ahead. The consul dozed, snapping awake each time with a sense of falling, hands gripping the edge of the rigid hawking mat. He realized that he should have tied himself with the single rope he had brought in his bag, but he didn't want to land. The grass was sharp and higher than his head. Although he had seen none of the telltale V-shaped wakes of the grass serpents, he could not be sure they were not resting in wait below. He wondered idly where the wind wagon had gone. The thing had been fully automated and presumably programmed by the Church of the Shrike, since they had sponsored the pilgrimage. What other duties might the thing have had? The consul shook his head, sat upright, and pinched his cheeks. He had been drifting in and out of dreams even as he thought about the wind wagon. 15 hours had seemed a short enough time as he stood talking about it in the Valley of the Time Tombs. He glanced at his comm log. 5 hours had passed. The consul lifted the mat to 200 meters, looked carefully for any sign of a serpent, then brought the mat down to a hover 5 meters above the grass. Carefully he extracted the rope, made a loop, moved to the front of the carpet, and wound several lengths around the carpet, leaving enough slack to slide his body in before tightening the knot. If the mat fell, the tether would be worse than useless, but the snug bands of rope against his back gave a sense of security as he leaned forward to tap the flight designs again, leveled the carpet out at 40 meters, and laid his cheek against the warm fabric. Sunlight filtered through his fingers, and he realized that his bare forearms were getting a terrible sunburn. He was too tired to sit up and roll down his sleeves. A breeze came up. The consul could hear a rustling and sliding below as either the grasses blew or something large slithered past. He was too tired to care. The consul closed his eyes and was asleep in less than 30 seconds. The consul dreamed of his home, his true home, on Maui Covenant, and the dream was filled with color. The bottomless blue sky, the wide expanse of the South Sea, ultramarine fading to green where the equatorial shallows began, the startling greens and yellows and orchid reds of the Motile Isles as they were herded north by the dolphins. Extinct now since the hegemony invasion in the consul's childhood, but quite alive in his dream, breaking the water in great leaps that sent 1,000 prisms of light dancing in the pure air. In his dream, the consul was a child again, and he stood on the highest level of a treehouse on their first family isle. Grandmother Siri was next to him, not the regal grande dame he had known, but the beautiful young woman his grandfather had met and fallen in love with. The tree sails were flapping as the southerlies came up, moving the herd of motile isles in precise formation through the blue channels through the shallows. Just on the northern horizon he could see the first of the equatorial archipelago islands rising green and permanent against an evening sky. Siri touched his shoulder and pointed to the west. The isles were burning, sinking, their keel roots writhing in purposeless pain. The dolphin herders were gone. The sky rained fire. The consul recognized billion-volt lances as they fried the air and left blue-gray afterimages on his retinas. Underwater explosions lighted the oceans and sent thousands of fish and fragile sea creatures bobbing to the surface in their death throes. "Why?" asked Grandmother Siri, but her voice was the soft whisper of a teenager. The consul tried to answer her, but could not. Tears blinded him. He reached for her hand, but she was no longer there, and the sense that she was gone, that he could never make up for his sins, hurt him so badly that he found it impossible to breathe. His throat was clogged with emotion. Then he realized that it was smoke that burned his eyes and filled his lungs. The family aisle was on fire. The child who was the consul staggered forward in the blue-black darkness, hunting blindly for someone to hold his hand, to reassure him. A hand closed on his. It was not Ceres. The hand was impossibly firm as it squeezed. The fingers were blades. The consul came awake, gasping. It was dark. He had slept for at least 7 hours. Struggling with the ropes, he sat up, stared at his glowing comlog display. 12 hours. He had slept for 12 hours. Every muscle in his body ached as he leaned over and peered below. The hawking mat held a steady altitude of 40 meters, but he had no idea where he was. Low hills rose and fell below. The mat must have cleared some by only 2 or 3 meters. Orange grass and scrub lichen grew in spongy tufts. Somewhere, sometime in the past few hours, he had passed over the south shore of the Sea of Grass, missed the small port of Edge and the Hooghly River docks where their levitation barge, Benares, had been tied up. The consul had no compass. Compasses were useless on Hyperion, and his comlog had not been programmed as an inertial direction finder. He had planned to find his way back to Keats by following the Hooghly south and west, retracing the laborious path of their upriver pilgrimage minus the bends and turns in the river. Now he was lost. The consul set the hawking mat down on a low hilltop, stepped off to solid ground with a groan of pain, and collapsed the mat. He knew that the charge in the flight threads must be at least a third expended by now, perhaps more. He had no idea how much efficiency the mat lost with age. The hills looked like the rough country southwest of the Sea of Grass, but there was no sight of the river. His comlog told him that it had been dark for only an hour or two, but the consul could see no hint of sunset in the west. The skies were overcast, shielding both starlight and any space battles from sight. "Damn," whispered the consul. He walked around until circulation returned, urinated at the edge of a small drop-off, and returned to his mat to drink from a water bottle. Think. He had set the mat on a southwesterly course that should have left the Sea of Grass at or near the port city of Edge. If he had simply overflown Edge and the river while he slept, the river would be somewhere to his south, off to his left. But if he had aimed poorly as he left Pilgrim's Rest, been just a few degrees off to his left, then the river would be winding northeast somewhere to his right. Even if he went the wrong way, he eventually would find a landmark, the coast of the northern Main, if nothing else, but the delay could cost him a full day. The consul kicked at a rock and folded his arms. The air was very cool after the heat of the day. A shiver made him realize that he was half sick from sunburn. He touched his scalp and pulled his fingers away with a curse. Which way? The wind whistled through low sage and sponge lichen. The consul felt very far removed from the time tombs and the threat of the Shrike, but he felt the presence of Saul and Duray and Het Masteen and Brawne and the missing Silenus and Kassad as an urgent pressure on his shoulders. The consul had joined the pilgrimage as a final act of nihilism, a pointless suicide to put an end to his own pain, pain at the loss of even the memory of wife and child, killed during the hegemony's machinations on Brescia, and pain at the knowledge of his terrible betrayal. Betrayal of the government he had served for almost 4 decades, betrayal of the ousters who had trusted him. The consul sat on a rock and felt that purposeless self-hatred fade as he thought of Saul and his infant child waiting in the Valley of the Time Tombs. He thought of Brawne, that brave woman, energy incarnate, lying helpless with that leech-like extension of the Shrike's evil growing from her skull. He sat, activated the mat, and rose to 800 meters, so close to the ceiling of clouds that he could have raised a hand and touched them. A second's break in the cloud cover far to his left showed a glint of a ripple. The Hoolie lay about 5 clicks to the south. The consul banked the hawking mat steeply to his left, feeling the tired containment field trying to press him to the carpet, but feeling safer with the ropes still attached. 10 minutes later he was high over the water, swooping down to ascertain that it was the broad Hoolie rather than some tributary. It was the Hoolie. Radiant gossamers glowed in the low, marshy areas along the banks. The tall, crenellated towers of architect ants cast ghostly silhouettes against a sky only slightly darker than the land. The consul rose to 20 meters, took a drink of water from his bottle, and headed downriver at full speed. Sunrise found him below the village of Doukhobors Copse, almost to the Karla Locks, where the Royal Transport Canal cut west toward the northern urban settlements and the main. The consul knew that it was less than 150 clicks to the capital from here, but it was still a maddening 7 hours away at the hawking mat's slow pace. This was the point in the trip where he had hoped to find a military skimmer on patrol, one of the passenger dirigibles from the copse of Naiad, even a fast powerboat he could commandeer. But there was no sign of life along the banks of the Hoolie except for the occasional burning building or ghee lamps in distant windows. The docks had been stripped of all boats. The river manta pens above the locks were empty, the great gates open to the current, and no transport barges were lined up below where the river widened to twice its upriver size. The consul swore and flew on. It was a beautiful morning as the sunrise illuminated the low clouds and made every bush and tree stand out in the low, horizontal light. It felt to the consul as if it had been months since he had seen real vegetation. Weirwood and half-oak trees rose to majestic heights on the distant bluffs, while in the floodplain the rich light caught the green shoots of a million periscope beans, rising from their indigene paddies. Woman-grove root and fire-fern lined the banks, and each branch and twisting stood out in the sharp light of sunrise. The clouds swallowed the sun. It began to rain. The consul tugged on the battered tricorn, huddled in Kassad's extra cloak, and flew on southward at 100 meters. The consul tried to remember. How long did the child Rachel have? Despite his long sleep the day before, the consul's mind was heavy with fatigue toxins. Rachel had been 4 days old when they had arrived at the valley. That had been 4 days ago. The consul rubbed his cheek, reached for a water bottle, and found them all empty. He could easily dip down and refill the bottles in the river, but he did not want to take the time. His sunburn ached and made him shiver as the rain dripped from his cap. Saul said that as long as I'm back by nightfall, it would be all right. Rachel was born after 2000 hours, translated to Hyperion time. If that's right, if there's no error, she has until 8 tonight. The consul rubbed water from his cheeks and eyebrows. Say 7 more hours to Keats. An hour or 2 to liberate the ship. Theo will help. He's Governor-General now. I can convince him that it's in the hegemony's interest to countervene Gladstone's orders to quarantine the ship. If necessary, I'll tell him that she ordered me to conspire with the ousters to betray the web. Say 10 hours plus the 15-minute flight in the ship. Should be at least an hour to spare before sunset. Rachel will be only a few minutes old, but what? What do we try besides the cryogenic fugue lockers? Nothing. It has to be that. It was always Saul's last chance, despite the doctor's warnings that it might kill the child. But then, what about Brawne? The consul was thirsty. He pulled back the cloak, but the rain had lessened to the point that it was a fine drizzle, just enough to wet his lips and tongue to make him more thirsty. He cursed softly and began to descend slowly. Perhaps he could hover over the river just long enough to fill his bottle. The hawking mat quit flying 30 meters above the river. 1 second it was descending gradually, as smooth as a carpet on a gentle glass incline, and the next instant it was tumbling and plummeting out of control, a 2-meter rug and terrified man thrown out of the window of a 10-story building. The consul screamed and tried to jump free, but the rope connecting him to the carpet and the duffel strap tied to his belt tangled him in the flapping mass of the hawking mat, and he fell with it, tumbling and twisting, the final 20 meters to the hard surface of the waiting Hooghly River. And that is where we will call it for this week, on that thrilling note. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Hope people are digging it. I know I am. Such a good book. So many great details. One thing I really have to give Dan Simmons is just the richness of the visual detail that he's able to impart. Just the very fertility of the ideas that he's using. It's just so, like, if you're an old-timey comics fan, Western comics fan, for either DC or Marvel, you've probably heard of like Jack Kirby and his ilk. And just like the amount of raw imagination that some people are able to have just leaves me flabbergasted. I just absolutely amazed. Anyway, yeah, that is where we will call it for now. Next week we've got, I think next week. Oh no, it'll be the start of the week after. We will have one of the greatest scenes, and a scene where I'm not totally sure what I'm going to how I'm going to narrate it, but we'll figure it out because it's got lots of interesting stuff going on. Anyway, good times. Do we have Keats doing any narrating next time? Yes, we do, finally, after like 4 weeks. Anyway, thanks again to everyone who tuned in. It's a gorgeous day out. I'm probably going to go take a walk. It's very nice. As I watch the river flowing rapidly. We've got ice out now at long last. It's been an unseasonably warm winter. But we were able to get a little ice pack build up, and it's gone now. It's gone. Anyway, I'm going to dip. Thanks again. To anyone tuning into this for the first time, I do these live. That's why they're kind of rough. But I do them live starting every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time or East Coast U.S. time, whatever it changes to after daylight savings. Eastern Daylight Time? Something like that. Anyway, 12 noon, usually around then. I'm usually a couple minutes late, much to my chagrin. If I'm ever going to have a schedule change, I'll try to make it very clear well in advance that that's going to have to happen. Sometimes emergencies crop up, though, and I won't. So, not too often. I'll generally know in advance. But yeah, with that, I'm going to go.
stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other, as always. See you all later. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend. And don't let the Shrike get you down.